Well, it's been an extraordinary 2 weeks. The Syrian rebels, which were holed up in Idlib for most of a decade, came roaring out and overthrew the Assad regime. This has tremendous implications for Syria, for the region, and really for the world in general. And I have to say that for the past couple weeks, I've gotten this entirely wrong, like humiliatingly wrong, like extraordinarily wrong. Let's just take one extraordinary example from December 2nd, after HTS, the leading rebel group, had taken Aleppo. Yusuf chimes in and says, I think it's time to recognize that HTS has managed to turn into a Houthi-like force, and they are here to stay. And I said, ha! Ha! Let's see if they can hold Aleppo for a year. We'll revisit it then. The Syrian rebellion is much more reminiscent of Yemen's internationally recognized government, fractious, hopeless, and largely failed despite massive support from the most powerful international actors. A week later, Yusuf correctly chimed in that this tweet had aged like the milk I bought last week, very poorly. Getting this conflict this wrong is especially humiliating because I kind of feel like the Syrian conflict is where I cut my teeth as a commentator. It's where I got the sort of extreme brand of cynicism that you may know this channel for. I lived in Istanbul. I watched the Syrian war happen. I got to Istanbul in 2011, left in 2016. So I went from someone who was like, yeah, Assad's going to fall, to someone who was is the spectacularly jaded commentator you may know today. So it's, I think, worthwhile to investigate why exactly I got this so wrong, why my expectations of the rebels were so low and my expectations of the Assad government were so much higher. It's important to do this analysis because things are likely to be a little more free-flowing now. I mean, who knows what the Syrian government's going to shape up to be? Who knows what the U.S.'s reaction is going to be, Israel's reaction is going to be, the rest of the region's reaction is going to be. So the first reason I screwed this up so badly, I think, is time. I've put together dozens of videos on the Syrian conflict, but the vast majority of them were before 2020 or even before 2019. The fact is that by 2018, and certainly by 2020, I considered this conflict to be over. Hey there, you probably haven't noticed, but over the past month, the war in Syria may have ended. This, of course, leaves us with the question, what now? When I started this series in the summer of 2016, Bashar Assad's regime controlled none of Syria's borders. He survived because he had an outlet to Russian aid from the sea and spotty but strong connections to Iran through Hezbollah and Lebanon. But even the Lebanese border had numerous rebel pockets to contend with. His borders with Iraq, Jordan, Turkey, and Israel were all controlled by differing mixes of ISIS and other foreign-supported jihadists. Over the 2 years since, he slowly scrapped his way back to control over much of the border with Iraq and completely cleared out the pockets of resistance on the Lebanese border and in the suburbs of Syria's major population centers. Viewers of this series will be very familiar with the situation on the northern border. We've talked about Aleppo, the al-Qaeda haven of Idlib, the U.S. protectorate of Kurdish-led northeastern Syria, and the Turkish conquests in Afrin in some detail. Turkey's border with Syria will likely continue to be a fiasco for years, if not decades, to come. And this conflict was over. Like, Assad had won. He had come from losing a lot of the nation's territory to winning back almost all of it. The rebels were cramped up into a small area, and they looked very unlikely to be able to make their way out of it. That was where we were for honestly most of a decade. I only have one video on Syria for the entirety of the Biden administration because I wanted to argue that it would be a good idea to get out of Syria the way we had just gotten out of Afghanistan. There didn't appear to be much happening in Syria, so I didn't pay attention. That's, of course, not a defense for getting things so wrong this past week, but it is sort of an excuse. The second thing I got wrong was a massive underestimate of the rebels that were crammed into Idlib in the north of the country. I saw them as sort of like a desperate grab bag of fighting fundamentalists, fighting against the Kurds, fighting against the Syrian regime a little bit, but most importantly, fighting against each other. I had no respect for their ability to actually band together and work against the Syrian government in a serious way. I just didn't see it happening. And in my defense, that's the way it was when I was looking at the Syrian conflict more intensely half a decade ago. Like, they were just sort of stuck there. I've got a video from 2016 that I'm going to show a lot of, in part because it's kind of amusing to see how I made videos 8 years ago, but to illustrate how my critique of these rebel groupings actually made sense at the time. But I think my great falling was that I never really revised from this 8 years old video all the way down until 2 weeks ago. My expectation was that these guys were a joke and they weren't capable of anything. And that has changed in meaningful ways, but it is still an open question just how much it has changed. So let's roll this old clip that explains why I underestimated the rebels so much.
Hello all. So here's a simple question. What happens if the United States wins in Syria? To figure that out, first you have to know what the US government actually wants, which is not what it says it wants. Humanity's priority in Syria is defeating ISIS. Washington, D.C.'s priority is defeating Assad. So, let's say it somehow all works out. Let's say that both ISIS and the Assad regime have fallen. What would that look like? Who would be in charge? The Kurds are nice. They aren't religious crazies, and they may be the only people in Syria who are fully committed to fighting ISIS. But they're not interested in taking much non-Kurdish territory, and they're also allied with Assad, which nobody likes to talk about. The United States government uses the term moderate opposition a lot. This seems to apply to anybody who isn't actively affiliated with ISIS or Al-Qaeda this week. This is really dumb. These groups change names and affiliations all the time. There are still individual villages and neighborhoods that are controlled by less religious Sunni rebel forces, in the south of the country especially. But the majority of rebel territory is taken and controlled by radical Sunni Islamic fundamentalists. There's a very simple way to understand this that the typical Syria control maps leave out. Syria is divided into 14 governorates. To date, the Syrian opposition has only managed to take 4 of the least populous provinces. Hasaka is mostly controlled by the Kurds. ISIS has controlled Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor since 2013. The opposition's greatest victory came in 2015, when they took the capital city and most of the province of Idlib. This was done by Jaish al-Fatah, a moderate opposition group made up almost exclusively of Al-Qaeda affiliates and a number of other groups that want to turn Syria into a Sunni Islamic state. Many of these people fought against U.S. soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan. Most of them are not directly affiliated with a terrorist organization today, but who cares? Just because they're focused on Assad now doesn't mean they won't be focused on Iraq or Paris once he's gone. Al-Nusra, one of the most powerful groups, has just announced that it is no longer affiliated with Al-Qaeda. Once again, who cares? Al-Qaeda's leader, Ayman al-Zawahiri, fully endorsed the split, which should make it clear that this is just a PR exercise. For the past 5 years, the Western governments have been hosting a bunch of high-level Syrian defectors in places like Istanbul and Geneva. These guys are mostly secular-ish and kinda pro-Western. The US says these guys are gonna take over after Assad. That's ridiculous. Assad's regime will be taken down by Sunni fundamentalists, and they won't have the slightest bit of interest in signing the country over to a bunch of folks who have spent the past 5 years manning laptops. These guys want a caliphate, not a puppet government. These are the guys that the US government wants to give Syria to, whether they admit it or not. What would that look like? Well, they'd want a strict Sunni Islamic state, and they'd want revenge against the Alawi, Shia, and Christian populations that have been fighting against them for the past 5 years. How do you think that would go? Assad is an evil bastard. If there was one Sunni fundamentalist group to deal with, then at this point, maybe dealing with them would be the right thing to do. Centralized power could keep massacres from happening, or at least keep the ethnic cleansing mostly non-lethal. The problem is that that central power does not exist. Assad is currently making great strides in the Damascus suburb of Ghouta. This is because the two Islamist militias holding the area are more interested in fighting each other than they are in fighting the government. Northern Syria is still divided between ISIS and the rest of the Sunni radicals, as it has been since 2013. This infighting between rebel groups has killed tens of thousands.
So as that lengthy clip illustrated, there were two big things I got wrong. Number one, I didn't think that the rebels in Idlib were truly capable of unified action. And number two, I thought they were never going to get far enough away from hardcore Sunni militancy to be able to work with anybody in Syria or internationally. Those two things that I got wrong are connected to each other. Being able to actually unify has a lot to do with dialing down the intolerance. And both of those things seem to have happened at the guidance of the guy in charge of HTS. That is the latest rebranding of the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. It's clear if you've paid any attention to interviews with Jelani over the years that he has seriously changed the way that he markets himself. He is clearly going for a more secular approach. All of the communications over the past 2 weeks have been very reassuring. What that actually means in practice, of course, remains to be seen. I got to say, this is something that I've been wrestling with over the past couple weeks. I was very angry still in 2016 when I made that video that you just saw about 9/11. I'm still, I'm going to be angry about 9/11 for the rest of my life. But at a certain point, this guy who was a teenager barely a teenager, when 9/11 happened and then chose to fight for Al-Qaeda, does that mean that he's permanently disbarred from any legitimacy? I know that we're working with plenty of elements in Iraq who were killing U.S. soldiers back during the insurgency. So is this like a permanent disqualification? I think at a certain point, you've got to weigh, is Syria ever going to be able to unify and recover against being angry about things that this guy might have done as a foot soldier a long time ago? That's an open question. I think what's most important is what Jelani does now. And I think it's important to emphasize that it's the United States that gets to decide here. These moves towards being open to minorities, these moves towards not hassling women, like stuff like that, are definitely useful to HTS, the Jelani's group that seems like the overarching folks in charge. They're useful to them to maintain power in Syria, but they are vastly more useful and vastly more intended to curry favor with the West, which means to curry favor with the U.S. government. So it's our choice now. Are we going to lift the sanctions against Syria more broadly? That's a distinct question of, are we going to lift the sanctions against HTS? It seems like Jelani has made overtures, like he's willing to just sort of disband HTS. Of course, he'd retain major power behind the scenes, but we can just get rid of that last bit of Al-Qaeda stench or what have you. Are we going to lift the $10 million bounty on al-Jelani's head? These are all questions that will help determine how far the leaders of Syria stray away from Sunni militancy. They need to be rewarded. They've already moved a long way towards us. We should slowly move towards them with the understanding that any benefits that they start getting will, instantly stop if we see large-scale murders of religious minorities or women being harassed or things like that.
Assad is an evil bastard. If there was one Sunni fundamentalist group to deal with, then at this point, maybe dealing with them would be the right thing to do. Centralized power could keep massacres from happening, or at least keep the ethnic cleansing mostly non-lethal.
It's a very important thing to stay on top of, and I think it's important to try to look beyond the old prejudices of how we see this group, as I was absolutely not able to do before 2 weeks ago. It's clear that there are real reserves of organizational capacity in Idlib that were built up in Idlib over the past 8 years when I was simply not paying attention. Um, who's to say what's going to happen next? But it's clear that I got this question of the nature and the capacities of the rebels very, very wrong. And I hope that now that those rebels are pretty much the Syrian government, I hope the U.S. government does not make the same mistake. The third reason I got the Syrian conflict wrong is probably the hardest one for me to admit, because it gets to the core of one of my critiques of U.S. government actions all over the place. I've talked a lot for years now about U.S. sanctions and how I think they're pretty useless. I think they mostly serve to actually keep regimes in power. That's sort of what they mostly do, keep them miserable, keep them antagonistic so we can fight a war against them later. That's my general perception of what U.S. sanctions do, and the past 2 weeks seem to have blown that up entirely. The U.S. sanctions against Syria worked. They worked really well. I think that after Israel's destruction of Hezbollah, the Caesar sanctions that we smacked on the country in 2020 are the second biggest reason why the Assad regime fell. Obviously, sanctions, my critique survives on some levels. Sanctions alone can't do this, but they are clearly a part of the U.S. government's arsenal that can function and functioned to destroy the Syrian government. I think you have to go back to the 1980s and South Africa, which also had a whole array of other pressures against it, to find another example of where sanctions were this effective. I'd have to say it again, as much as it kills me to say it. U.S. sanctions played a tremendously large role in the overthrow of this regime. Again, Assad had won this war as far back as 2018. I mean, there was another kerfluffle in the north in 2020. Turkey took more territory, but that was mostly fighting between Turkey and the Kurds. Assad had won, and he looked to be able in 2018, 2019 to start the rebuilding process. And we used our sanctions to turn that victory into ashes. Even if nothing changes up in northern Syria, though, Assad has most of his borders back. The region's communication and trade links, destroyed by the U.S.-created war on Syria back in 2011, have finally been put back together. Incidentally, this is great for Jordan, which has been suffering mightily from the loss of trade with Syria throughout the war. Business can start again. What we should be talking about now is reconstruction. The $250 billion US that this is expected to take will require participation from the United States and from US-supported institutions like the United Nations if it's going to be at all successful. I was never under any illusions that the Syrian people loved Assad the way that some other Western commentators have allowed themselves to be deluded. But what I did believe, and believed fervently in 2018, 2019, 2020, is that the Syrian public were willing to give Assad a chance on the idea that it would be better than the chaos and destruction and mass murder that rebel elements like the Islamic State, like HTS and others had provided, really just an alternative to chaos. They were like, well, Assad's not great, but clearly the rebels failed. Let's just try to go back to like normal life. Let's try, even under a dictatorship, let's try to rebuild things. And I don't want to make a case for like Assad would have been fine without these sanctions, because clearly it was gangster mismanagement all the way down. But it was the sanctions that made it impossible for Syria to ever rebuild. It was the Caesar Syria Civilian Protection Act, signed into law by President Trump in December 2019 and came into force June 17th, 2020. So basically, as soon as the fighting stopped, the United States stopped Syria from being able to engage in any economic activity. These are the, sort of secondary sanctions that the United States has only applied to a few countries that are the extreme version, countries like Iran and Venezuela, that mean not only can Syria not do business with the United States, they're not allowed to do business with anybody else. Supposedly there are humanitarian exceptions, but when when U.S. sanctions this extreme are applied, every business just prefers to ignore that country forever, including medical and food businesses. So really the misery just continued. We failed in our sort of fund a bunch of militias to overthrow Assad project. So we slapped on these sanctions that I think played the number 2 role after Israel's destruction of Hezbollah in overthrowing Assad. Again, sanctions can work. Have to revise a few things in the way that I analyze things. But, for a close, I want to point out that, yes, the Assad regime was finally defeated. Yes, that is a great thing for humanity. And I guess to the extent that U.S. sanctions played a role in that, we can sort of, have one cheer for that. But I want to now run one of my favorite videos I actually did on this channel almost in its entirety because, Assad's a bad man. Yeah, getting rid of Assad is great. The United States had infinitely better peaceful tools in its quiver to get rid of Assad. And in fact, Assad was open to letting that happen in 2009, 2010. And instead we opted for the destruction of the country of Syria. So there you go. I was wrong about Syria, but nothing I've seen over the past couple weeks leads me to believe that much of anything in the following video is wrong. Thanks.
Hello. Over the past couple weeks, I think I've done a fairly effective job demolishing U.S. policy in Syria. There's one excuse left, though, that I think a lot of people find pretty persuasive. Assad is a really bad man, and his father was awful as well. Aren't we doing the Syrian people a favor by at least trying to take down this awful dictatorship? That feels like the right answer. But if you look at recent history, you can see that it's really, really not. Assad is a bad man. The year I was born, the majority of the world was run by men just as bad as Assad. A lot of them were worse. Suharto of Indonesia comes to mind. He ruled for 31 years and easily killed 1 million people. Most of the Asian countries we see as more or less democratic today were dictatorships in 1979, including Indonesia, South Korea, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Thailand. Even Japan was ruled by a single party from World War II until the 1990s. All of Eastern Europe was ruled by totalitarian communists. Some of them were ruled by one man, and some were ruled by groups, but they were all harshly repressive. Most of Latin America was ruled by dictators as well, either left-wing or right-wing. Even Mexico was ruled by a single party from 1929 to 2000. Over the course of my life, all of these countries have changed dramatically, and they've changed for the better. No country is perfect, but they've all become freer places, with elections and safer, happier people. How many of them got there through massive military interventions like the one we're supporting in Syria today? Not a single one. The countries that transitioned successfully transitioned peacefully. There were 2 countries in 1979 that got the full Syria treatment. The first is Afghanistan, that I've discussed at some length earlier in this series. That obviously didn't go very well for the Afghan people. The other country was Nicaragua. Back in the 1980s, the Reagan administration got into a lot of trouble for funding the Contras in an attempt to overthrow the regime of Daniel Ortega. Our policies made a nasty civil war worse. It lasted a full decade and killed tens of thousands of people. And who's the president of Nicaragua today? Daniel Ortega. When you try to persuade a dictatorship to improve or bribe it with trade, it usually fades away. When you go after it militarily, you either destroy the country or you make that dictator much more powerful. It remains to be seen which one of these will happen to Syria. So no, we're not helping the Syrian people by going after Assad. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. And if you'd like to help me make more videos like this one, please click on the Patreon link here to find out how. Thanks.